first meeting of Corporate Policy Development and Scrutiny Panel of this new administration. Good to see so many people here. The introductions, I'm sure councillors have their names in front of us. And that said, pass across to Michaela, who's going to do the emergency evacuation procedure and apologies.
When the continuous alarm bell sounds, you must evacuate the building by one of the designated exits and proceed to the named assembly point. The designated exits are signposted. Arrangements are in place for the safe evacuation of disabled people. Apologies for absence. I've had apologies from Councillor Ollie Henman.
Thank you very much. Declarations of interest. Don't think we have any declarations. If at any point in time a panel member feels that they do have a declarable interest, then please just flag it up and we'll make sure it goes into the minutes. Agenda item 5 is urgent business. I've got no urgent business to bring up, and then we move on to the minutes of the panel meeting on the 13th of March and the 3rd of April, so long ago. Are there any questions about those minutes? And Fine, okay, that's great, thank you. And I guess, do I have to sign those off at some point?
Yes, I've got them.
Fine, thank you. And then we have items from the public or councillors receiving statements or questions. We've actually got 3 statements. We've got David Redgewell, who is not
here
with us, and we've got Eleanor and Sean, who are presumably speaking for 3 minutes on the call-in. Okay. Eleanor, do you want to have first go then? Thank you.
I thought it was going to be organised with the lead person speaking first on the call-in subject, and then we would follow.
I'm happy for that to happen. The way it's appeared in the agenda is making statements now, but I will call you in when that agenda item comes up. Is that okay? Thank you. And so we move swiftly across to the call-in for the Entry Hill depot site. Everyone's seen the attached report. Can I just say as well that I have had advice on whether or not the panel needs to move into exempt session because some of the information that has been provided is, so say, commercially sensitive. My preference is not to go into exempt session unless we absolutely have to, and I know that there are councillors here, and I've had a discussion with Michael beforehand, but certainly I don't want to see exempt session exclude other Baines councillors because they don't happen to be members of this panel. So, that said, then first of all, we've got a statement from the lead call-in member, Kendra Hedges.
Thank you, Chair. Less than a month before the local elections on 13 April 2023, former Cabinet Member for Resources, Councillor Richard Samuel, approved a plan to give council officers the authority to sell or lease the Entry Hill depot site to a local manufacturing company. The Entry Hill depot site is a council-owned plot of land in a former stone quarry next to the former Entry Hill golf course. 2 residential streets with about 20 homes sit directly along the site, with further properties neighbouring the site on the other side of the road opposite the entrance to the depot. The process of quickly selling the land means that an environmental impact assessment on the site has not taken place, so the detail for this is not in place. All councillors are supportive of the needs for the area to have good jobs and local businesses, but the rush to sell this land without any environmental processes in place at a time when the council has declared a climate and ecological emergency does appear to be questionable. This decision was called in on 20th of April 2023 by 16 councillors. While I wasn't one of the original signatories, I'm here today to discuss this decision, which many at the time believed to be rushed and unfair due to the local elections. I will highlight our concerns, and I will discuss why I think the Council's decision to dispose of the land undermines the Council's climate and ecological emergency declarations, strategic priorities and policies. The first reason given for the decision to lease or sell the land is biodiversity net gain, and that this can be achieved by the company's development plans for the land. Biodiversity net gain is a new process designed for the planning system to make sure new development delivers a net positive impact on the natural environment. While we accept that the plans for a new factory could achieve biodiversity net gain, mostly by only developing part of the land, it is not a good reason for a sale. No due consideration has been paid to the impact that the disposal of the Entry Hill depot will have on the local ecology of the area, including species with European legal protection such as bats. The felling of mature trees on the site will have serious adverse repercussions to wildlife and could result in permanent environmental damage. The second reason given for the sale is that residential or mixed-use development is not achievable on the land because of contamination and the difficulty of showing biodiversity net gain. The Lib Dem administration have previously said that the only thing holding them back from building more social housing was the difficulty in acquiring land. The report clearly states that the land is presently contaminated, but if this is the case, is it safe for workers to be on this site? The council does already own this piece of land, so why not consider in depth the cost of making this site a place for council-owned residential housing as an option before taking a decision? With the local plan taking place at the moment, this seems a good opportunity to revisit the plans for the land. The former Entry Hill golf course next to the Entry Hill depot site has been subject to controversy over the last few years because of the plans for a bike park, which was stopped after extensive consultations, including with the local and wider community. For the decision on the Entry Hill depot, there was insufficient consultation with only 5 days allowed for responses. Councillors have also expressed deep concerns about transparency, as the site was not listed on the market but sold by the Red Book valuation approach. My main concern is that the council seems to be keen to welcome a factory into a densely populated residential area of a city within a World Heritage Site without any regard for the ecological environment or the community. In addition, Entry Hill has been selected as one of the 15 livable neighbourhoods areas, a decision made in June 2021, long before the decision on the disposal of the Entry Hill depot site was taken. No consideration seems to have been given to the fact that the entrance to the depot site is within the livable neighbourhood area of Entry Hill. According to the Council's website, Livable Neighbourhoods is a community-led programme that aims to improve residential streets and encourage safe, active and more sustainable forms of travel, such as walking, wheeling and cycling. Typical improvements suggested by communities are better crossings, footways and cycle lanes to connect homes with shops, schools and community hubs, traffic calming measures to tackle antisocial driving, speeding and inconsiderate parking, pleasant places for people to sit and meet others outside. The decision to dispose of the Entry Hill depot site is the opposite of a community-led decision with minimal consultation within the council and no community consultation. One of the reasons for not considering residential development of the Entry Hill depot site is given, I quote, a housing site with more movement by car, pedestrians and cyclists will involve more design input and is more difficult to achieve. Yet the proposed use as a manufacturing site would potentially have more motorised movements, with 15 staff regularly travelling in by car and further compounded by the introduction of significant HGV traffic into a narrow residential street. This use would force far more significant and involved design input while undermining the Council's flagship Livable Neighbourhood programme with its beneficial aim, an area where safe, active and more sustainable forms of travel are supposed to be dominant. I ask that this committee halts this process in the short term and ask for an environmental impact assessment and the production of a detailed comparative costs and benefits analysis of this proposed use versus that of building council housing. Please note again that all councillors fully support the need for business in the city, but it does require that due diligence is taken on this matter, especially when the land is owned by the taxpayer and the sale of it would have to take place in a matter of weeks. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'd suggest now I'm going to bring in Eleanor and Sean to make your 3-minute statements, and then we'll go to questions after that. You first, Sean? You happy with that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair. Okay, so in a recent email I received from Baines Council, the rules regarding disposal of council property were explained to me, and I quote, "These are set out in Section 123 of the Local Government Act 1972. In summary, the Council has to demonstrate that it has achieved the best consideration for all its property transfers. The best way to demonstrate this is to place the property on the open market. It goes on to explain that when the council is looking to achieve a specific corporate objective as a main reason to transact with a single party, then the council will consider a red book valuation in lieu of a marketing exercise as an assessment of value. Nevertheless, the process does lack clear transparency of the marketing exercise, and then sale by tender or by private treaty, especially when the extent of the market and the number of likely interested parties is unknown. So this gives rise to a number of concerns. Your report notes that this is, and again I quote, a rare opportunity to acquire a development site in a desirable location in Bath. The site is rare, desirable and unique. So how can we have confidence in a red book valuation without testing the markets and understand all the interested parties and development options? The report seems to place weights in a capital receipt within this financial year, but surely it's more important to find the best outcome, however long it takes. After all, we'll have to live with the result of this for decades to come. We are committed to building social and affordable homes and currently have 5,500 residents on a housing waiting list. We have been unable to influence the current large-scale housing developments along the Lower Bristol Road in Bath, which will deliver practically none of the 30% social affordable homes that our policies require. So perhaps here is an opportunity for us to build a development without the constraints of commercial developments, and that is both sensitive to housing needs and the environment and the ecological desires and values of this council. Alternatively, perhaps we could build the industrial space and add this into our property portfolio, securing a long-term revenue stream. This would also give us protection from any potential future requests for increased site development. Whatever option, it's important that we're both transparent and consistent in our decision-making process, and that the application of the rules, and most importantly, the residents have a significant say in any neighbourhood developments they have to live with. Therefore, I look forward to listening to your debate.
Thank you very much. You left yourself 4 seconds to use it.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Listening to the two councillors who've spoken before me and reading through the papers concerning this flawed decision, which to me is indicative of misguided principles and mistaken process, I am reminded of when a, dare I say it, dodgy individual came to the door of my parents' house in Sutton Coldfield and persuaded my father to part with an old umbrella stand that was by the door. Of course, what he really wanted was the carved Victorian kist, which is Yorkshire for a dowry chest, of whose value he knew my father was ignorant. Fortunately, Dad dare not part with an heirloom from the maternal side of the family. Here we have a council asset for disposal, it seems, but I would suggest it's undervalued for the reasons that Councillor Hughes has already given, and that the would-be purchaser has a longer-term aim, perhaps, to get something more valuable, like the chest, and something which really belongs to the taxpayer rather than to the individual administration or cabinet member. My residents live 10 miles away. The nearest bus stop for them on the A367 is a total disgrace, and I spent 25 minutes there last Friday waiting for a bus. But even if it's not very accessible, this is their asset too, the residents who live in the Soma Valley. And I think we're back again with the saga of a family silver being sold off. However, that said, I do not believe that my views prejudice on how I would vote on any planning application which may appear subsequent to this change of use in the site. Planners, I hope, would insist on a proper environmental impact assessment, which to me seems to be lacking at present. And I would like to point out that given where we are in the cycle of the local plan process, There is no reason why, by 2026, this site could not be allocated for housing and developed in the way that Councillor Hughes suggested. In planning, you cannot make any assumptions about people's motives. So, not even former Councillor Richard Samuels, who's somebody I respected very much, and he's not in post now to explain his motives, sadly. I smell a black hole in the council finance, which I think the sale is meant to plug. Perish the thought. I do see a terrible lack of transparency and too much haste. For why should the first offer be accepted? If you are selling an antique, you get several valuations and put it to auction. I do not understand why, if Westfield Parish Council is required to get 2 to 3 quotes or valuations for any transaction, and why Westminster would have to take the highest offer, we don't have to follow the same path. It reminds me far too much of privatisation in the Thatcher Major era, when national assets were sold undervalued, and we're now paying the price with privatised water supplies and private public transports. Our residents expect you to look after our heritage, not flog it for a quick gain.
Colin.
Thank you, Chair. Saskia, you talked about the lack of the environmental impact assessment, and it appears to me that the plans to potentially go to Red Book valuation for a single purchase decision seems to be quite matured, in that we've seen drawings, we've seen all sorts of descriptions. How long would that type of assessment take to do? Any idea of the cost of doing that? Because I can't understand why that hasn't been done when all this other work seems to have been done to prepare to sell.
Thank you. I actually don't know. Eleanor and Sean, would you mind to comment?
In the ideal circumstances, and was comparable, for example, to the environmental statement that we've just received for the development at the University of Bath football pitch, it would take a year, because you have to observe the species in their behaviour at different times of year. But for purposes like this, I don't think you would need anything like as extensive as that. You just need to know how many bats, roughly, and how many woodpeckers, and so on. So you get a sort of snapshot. And you could always do the snapshot one, where you just get a snapshot. How much it would cost, I don't know, but a few thousand, I would imagine.
Saskia, thank you very much for your statement. I just wondered whether you had a view on the problems associated with the infill, the 5 metres of infill from fuel ash, and what your feelings about that, and whether it does offer a constraint on the development of the site.
Thank you. Well, while I'm obviously not an expert, I do understand that the proposed plans by the company include some building work. So I assume that if that building works can take place, then other building works, like for residential development, would be possible as well in some way. So those were my thoughts about that.
Thank you, Chair. I guess this is a question for Councillor Hughes, based on your statement regarding the desperate need in the district to secure affordable housing. In the short to medium term, this site is allocated in the local plan for employment. There are far too many constraints, it would appear, for residential to take place on there. Are you suggesting that the council should really wait for the local plan review and the call to sites for developing housing before it makes a decision on whether to sell the land off, on the assumption that if the council was to sell the land in the short term, the developer could actually benefit if the land allocation was actually changed to residential?
Okay, well, I think we're trying to push this along too quickly, perhaps, in terms of timescales. We need to decide what is the best use for the sites, which gives us the best benefits as a council, as a community, and we will adapt the site and the planning process to suit. If that takes an additional year or 2 years, we've got to build that into the full local plan that's being assessed at the moment, then so be it. But whatever decisions we make, we're going to have to live with for decades. So it's important that we get the right decision, regardless of the timescales it takes us to do that. So yes, I would say that we can't just dismiss the option of housing, particularly with our current status on housing needs and our lack of social and affordable housing in our area.
Thanks, Chair. Sean, you talked about the Section 123 Local Government Act and the fact that you can go to this Red Book with a corporate objective. What do you see that being here as a clear to bypass going to market and looking at best value?
Well, my opinion, looking at the report, is that I'm struggling to see a definitive reason for going for that route. I can see a number of reasons given. One seems to be very much based around the capital receipts and trying to get a capital receipt within this financial year, which for me shouldn't be a consideration at all in this process. I'm struggling to see anything unique about this particular site that would give us that reason to go to a single party without testing the market. And as I mentioned in my statement, you know, we've identified this site as rare and desirable, and rare and desirable has a value, and we haven't established what that value is yet. I'm not saying that this option isn't necessarily the right option, but first things first, we need to establish what's the site actually worth before we move forward.
Fine, okay, yes, sure.
Contamination is not a deterrent. We've got Bath Old Press in at the moment, that's a contaminated site. We've got Cobbler's Way in Westfield, which was a very similar quarry situation, and it's been built on successfully. So as long as you do proper scientific tests, as in Radstock on the railway lands, it's no problem.
If not, then...
Just one more, please. Thank you. Okay, come on. Biodiversity net gain. Maybe, Saskia, you can enlighten me in terms of understanding how a residential alternative to a commercial site, how do they compare in terms of a biodiversity net gain? It seems a funny term in some respects when you're developing something.
Yes, I agree. Again, I'm not an expert, but I understand that a biodiversity net gain is definitely possible in residential development, as it is in a business development, and we've seen examples. So it's not impossible. And as I said before, I don't think showing biodiversity net gain as a reason for a sale, because we haven't explored this in a residential development or mixed use.
Yes, good afternoon. I don't have a name badge, but my name's Paul Roper and I'm Cabinet Member for Economic and Cultural Sustainable Development. Thank you all for your time today. I am here to represent the Cabinet Member, former Councillor Samuel, who was involved in the decision. As you may know, Councillor Samuel did not stand for re-election, and therefore it's incumbent upon me as the new Cabinet Member with a portfolio encompassing the Council's corporate estate services to provide you with a statement in response to the questions raised resulting in this scrutiny. The background is relevant, and I will summarise this, but first it's worthwhile highlighting the fundamental point that the Entry Hill depot site, which is under consideration for disposal and the subject of the decision taken by former Councillor Samuel, is separate from the adjacent Entry Hill golf course site. Please also note the adjacent Entry Hill golf course site is not part of this disposal. The subject site has been redundant for several years and is surplus to operational requirements. Its historic use has always been industrial in nature, from the initial quarry workings to its use as a corporate depot used by highways. Once it became apparent that this site was surplus to operational requirements, it seemed obvious that the Council should look for alternative uses that could fulfil the Council's objectives, and therefore the Council's associated housing company, ADL, undertook due diligence and investigation to potentially develop the site for residential accommodation. A HAB architect feasibility report, together with an ecological survey, were produced in June to October 2017. For many reasons, including ground conditions, ecology, highways issues and contamination, ADL rejected the opportunity to bring the site forward for residential development. In August 2020, the Council received an unsolicited approach from Derek Walker Charter Surveyors, acting on behalf of their client, Cross Manufacturing. They confirmed interest to develop the site as a satellite manufacturing facility to their existing premises nearby. By way of background, it's worthwhile being aware that Cross employs almost 600 staff, of which 150 are based at its headquarters in Bath, with the remainder at its 2 factories in Devizes. 65% of its staff live within 10 miles of Bath and 30% within 5 miles. Cross's employee retention rate in Bath is impressive. Over 40% of staff based at Bath have worked for the company for more than 15 years. With the expansion into the subject site, Cross could secure storage space and create potential job opportunities within the local area. Cross anticipates that initial staff numbers will be in the region of 15. Further annual growth at both Entry Hill and the current Midford Road site is projected as the freed up space at Midford Road is better utilised. Given the low number of total staff, parking requirements at the new Entry Hill site will be correspondingly low. The estimated current gross value added for the Midford Road site is £93,500 per person. Based on a total headcount of around 150, the total estimated GVA is £14 million a year. The new facility at Entry Hill could add a minimum of 15 members of staff in the short term and therefore an additional GVA of £1.4 million a year, with the potential for additional growth as well as securing the future of this valuable company in Bath. With this in mind, the officer-led negotiations progressed on the principle of an initial 3-year lease to generate revenue, with an option to purchase the long leasehold or freehold interest at the expiry of the 3-year term. To meet the requirement for the Council to meet its statutory duty to achieve best consideration in all its property transactions, a third-party RICS Red Book valuation was commissioned to determine values. To make progress in regard to Cross's inquiry, an options paper was prepared by officers prior to negotiations with the interested party. This options paper was presented to the Council's Property Board, chaired by Councillor Samuel, and the outcome clearly ruled out the likelihood of residential development in the future, albeit the transaction, if progressed, would include a requirement to claw back value or overage should development prove possible at some point in the future. A site meeting was held on the 18th of July 2022, attended by Councillors Davis, Bourne and Dogood, with officers also in attendance, to discuss the pros and cons of residential development on the whole site, or the possibility of splitting the site 50-50 between residential and industrial development, exploring the potential for a small housing site but using exploring the potential for a small housing site but using Entry Hill Golf Club entrance. All options were discussed, and a briefing report provided the outcome of which concluded that for various reasons a split site was not feasible and that there was ecological benefits of an industrial development on the site as opposed to residential. Subsequently, on the 1st of December 2022, with a Cabinet Member for Resources in attendance, the steer given by the Property Board was that a single-member decision be submitted recommending proceeding with a disposal to Cross Manufacturing, albeit the organisation is not named specifically in the decision document. The decision was to be subject to the transfer to a single party without prior marketing on the basis that Cross Manufacturing could demonstrate the gross value added of their proposed development to Baines. I will now turn to the specific reasons for the call-in of the decision taken by former Councillor Samuel. The first reason was centred on insufficient consultation. In my background summary, I've explained that the specific site is and always was aligned with industrial or employment use, and that the options report confirmed that the point of view of the best fit with the ecology or ecological protection, it was agreed that the proposed employment use could be supported. In my full statement, I have enclosed a plan and aerial photograph of the site to ensure that individuals do not confuse the subject site location with the adjacent Entry Hill golf course. I have also explained why the Council would want to support the economic activity of the area and retain a local employer by agreeing to a transaction without prior marketing. Furthermore, I have explained in the synopsis how the transaction could be supported by evidencing that best consideration had been achieved in lieu of marketing, and moreover that any future financial benefit that could be exploited through gaining planning permission for an alternative use of higher value would be shared by the Council as vendor by utilising overage provisions. The reasons why the land in question was not openly marketed, but it was proposed to accept that a RICS Red Book value in lieu of this were explained in my synopsis, but to be clear, this methodology is regularly used to establish a market value at which to transact in many public sector organisations and would be procured at the expense of the applicant. The fact that this matter has been considered informally by a number of councillors and at length by the former councillor and Cabinet Member for Resources, leading to a formal member officer board providing their steer towards a formal member decision, to my mind provides adequate transparency and governance. This is safeguarded further by seeking the endorsement of the head of corporate estate and a Section 151 officer. Albeit I do take the point that this is a high-profile decision and it is unfortunate that its timing was so close to the last election and PERDA period, I can only advise that the timing was not deliberate but a direct result of officer capacity to prepare the final report and verify the conditionality of the proposed decision. I turn now to the second reason for the call-in, which was ecological damage with no due consideration. Turning to the second reason stated, which is entitled ecological damage, and which has in fact two reasons. The first part of the reason, which states that no due consideration has been paid to the impact of the disposal of the land at the former Entry Hill depot upon local ecology. I can point in particular to the option paper prepared by officers and considered by the Property Board, the outcome of which indicated that the preferred future use and least ecological impact was an employment use. Nevertheless, it's right to point out that the development can result in ecological damage if it is not regulated. As such, the purchaser would be required to seek planning permission in line with its future use and development proposals, and Baines, as a statutory planning authority, has a duty to protect the environment, habitat, and only permit development in line with statutory considerations. The concerns raised regarding due consideration not being given to the ecological impact of any development of the site are not warranted. A multitude of planning policies, to include NE2, conserving and enhancing the landscape and landscape character, NE2A, landscape setting of settlements, NE3, sites, species and habitats, NE5, ecological networks, and NE6, trees and woodland conservation, are material and are considered in line with statutory policies during the planning decision process. Therefore, councillors can be assured that these issues will be addressed and safeguards put in place by the planning authority. I'm nearly there. Regarding the action of the council in the felling of trees, officers advise that the ash trees at Entry Hill Depot are inspected annually for ash dieback disease. They were inspected in October 2021 and ash dieback was identified as present and causing up to 50% dieback of the canopy, which included the group to the rear of Entry Hill Rise. It had been decided that ash dieback was quite advanced in sections of this group, that they would be included in the ADB felling programme as there was an increasing risk of limb and whole stem failure falling onto buildings in the rear gardens. A tree did then fail during a storm and fell into a garden in November 21, causing damage. An external firm of surveyors carried out the inspection and recommended managing the trees by reducing them to reduce the risk of tree failure and damage to cliff face. Following the information received from retained surveyors, it was decided that as the ash trees were likely to die, that height reduction was not appropriate, so felling the ash trees to the rear of 2 to 10 Entry Rise was made a higher priority in the works programme. This was because of the additional detrimental impact of the failure of the tree structures on the stability of the cliff face and the adjacent properties. The first phase of ash dieback works was then included in the works programme to be carried out in early 2023. Councillors Dogood, Bourne, Curran and Pakanaya plus neighbours were informed in advance of the works and why the felling works had to be done. In addition, notices were posted on the gates to the depot. Regarding the Council's management of ash dieback disease, including mitigating these losses, there is an ash dieback action plan summary, and this can be found on the Baines website. I have enclosed photographs and site plans of the site in my statement if anyone wishes to view a copy to enable identification of the site and for clarity of the status of the land as it currently stands. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for that statement. Do you have any questions? Yes, Toby?
A couple of technical questions which you officers may have to help with. Firstly, I note in the figures that we've been provided that the Red Book valuation for residential is substantially higher than for industrial. Does that take account of the remediation costs and the deep piling that will be needed with the ash that's already on the site, or is it a per square metre for evaluation of a suitable site? The other question is the overage provisions. How long would an overage liability be retained as part in the sale? I take it the sale terms have been agreed at least as heads of terms, even as part of the option. Thank you.
Just look, Colin, ask questions.
So I'm going to take one question at a time and then consult, otherwise I'll forget what the officer has said. So in terms of the residential value, it excludes any remedial works. It does not take into account any contamination issues. And on the second question about the overage, so we believe that draft heads of terms are agreed and any overage would be in perpetuity.
Thank you. Colin?
Thank you, Chair. In my ward, Westmoreland, we've recently had Argyle Terrace, which was an old council depot. Didn't stand empty for that long, but it's been moved through to the portfolio of ADL, and they're creating accommodation on it, away from being used for commercial. The fact that this Entry Hill site has been empty for so long, and we've clearly not put any focus on it, one, just with Ian, why didn't we look at that in the local plan and consider that social housing might be an option, because we've had 4 years of having a focus on that. And secondly, I'm concerned about our use of ADL as our go-to to advise us whether this site might or might not be suitable for housing. That's been worked into the report, and I think I've been on record that I'm slightly concerned about the management of the way they go about their operations. And is that in the best interest of the council, or would we have been better looking at an alternative way to get that site evaluated, or whether housing might be suitable for it? Just as a case in point, as an organisation, if they are representing the council, I've discovered today that they've actually started work without pre-commencement decisions being discharged on Westgate Street. That shouldn't be happening. So are they representing us, and are they the right people to be doing this for us?
Well, on the first point, I would refer you to the statement, which was that a feasibility report, including ecological survey, were procured in June to October 2017, and it stated that for many reasons, including ground conditions, ecology, highways issues and contamination, ADL rejected the opportunity to bring the site forward for residential development. So there we are, they're the experts. And in regards to ADL suitability or probity, I'm not entirely sure that this is the forum. That is not the issue at discussion here. The issue is this call-in, so I can't comment about ADL. I'm afraid I know nothing about them. Sorry.
Any other questions? Lucy?
Yes, thank you, Councillor Rickard. I just wondered, did ACRES provide any valuation of the costs of dealing with the 5 metre fill? Did they break down their analysis for not proceeding? And secondly, one of the risk benefit analysis, one of the stated risks of not proceeding at the moment was evidence that cross engineering may relocate outside bars to a larger site outside Baines. They've been at their current site for a long time. I just wondered what the evidence was that they would go elsewhere if we didn't act quickly.
We have no specific figures on remediation of the 5 metres of the fuel ash. It was only looked at high level, but it was felt that the biggest obstacle was actually because of ecological factors, because of the density and the location of the housing would mean that less of the site could be retained for ecology. With regards to the second question, I don't think I need to refer to officers here. I can only speak as a business person. It's impossible to inquire as to whether a business is serious about relocating or not, and certainly I'm sure cross-engineering would not be prepared to make any sort of public statements about the likelihood of them doing so. So I'm afraid I can't really answer the question any more than that.
Thank you. So the Cabinet, the call-in basically is the Cabinet being asked to, not the Cabinet, apologies, still getting used to all the terms. The panel is being asked to consider disposal by lease or sale. So on the assumption that a negotiation with Cross took place and it was felt that it was best to lease the land for 3 years, in that time I'm assuming there would be a planning application with all due diligence, and the local plan authority would scrutinise that based on land use, conservation issues, contamination issues. Were the council then to decide, actually, we don't want to carry on with this lease, we want to take the land back, there's obviously going to be a cost in purchasing any building on there, but I'm assuming on that basis, if the local plan was amended or planning permission was subsequently submitted, maybe contrary to the development plan, to put housing on there, and the council will then get 100% benefit from that, excluding the cost of buying the buildings and demolishing those. If we went for sale immediately, you're suggesting that we have got the clause that would allow us to gain benefit and profit if housing took place in the future.
Okay, so a lease term was initially discussed, but the terms of that were such that the tenant, I don't know whether it's the lessor or the lessee, anyway, cross-engineering would have the right to buy the land at the end of the 3-year period. Therefore, it was deemed that it would just simply be sensible to move to a straight sale of the land. So the deal that is being discussed now does not involve lease; it's just purely disposal.
I suppose the obvious question is, why didn't you knew probably that this decision was going to be queried, why didn't you just put the land up for sale to see what the value of it was?
It's a very difficult question for me to answer because I wasn't in post when that decision was taken, so I'll just refer to the officers a minute. I think the answer is because we had the unsolicited approach from cross-engineering is the simple answer.
If it would just go straight to sale now, what would stop cross-engineering deciding they didn't have viable planning permission in a few years' time and then just trying to sell it for residential again then?
My understanding of what they're planning to use the property for initially is to use it for external storage, and to an extent you have to take them on trust that that's what they want to use it for. I can't imagine why they would want to buy it to develop housing. Cross-engineering have been in Bar since 1920. They're third generation. I'm not aware that they build any houses. There certainly doesn't say so in their accounts, which I read last week. I think it's also important to point out that they are taking a risk in buying this land because they don't have any planning permission to do anything on it other than, at the moment, use it as an open storage yard, which is how it's been used for a long time. So if they do take it forward for industrial development, it's not guaranteed that they will get planning for that because there will be all sorts of hurdles for them to jump through. Were they to apply for housing, then I would imagine they would face a number of hurdles, not which are the ecological issues, the fact that it's an industrial site, the fact that there's 5 metres of pulverised fuel ash. And ultimately, if they were successful, we have an overage provision which would claw back money because the value of the land would increase appreciably, and the council will be able to claw some of that back. So I hope that answers your question, Councillor Truby.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? If not, then thank you for those questions to the Cabinet Member. You have the opportunity for a closing statement.
Yes. Well, I just briefly wanted to talk about cross-engineering and the fact that they are a world-class local business, third-generation family business. This is public information because it's in their accounts. Their turnover is about £60 million. They export about 80% of their turnover to Europe and around the world. They are a world-class precision engineering company. They sponsor 3 PhDs through Bath University, and they are a leading player in the field that they operate, which is metal sealing bearings. They're the sort of company that you would want to have in your city, and I'm personally of the opinion that they are worthy of support from the council, because there are so few opportunities for the council to actually support local businesses, and this is one. They will be, if they do choose to go ahead with this, they will be faced with buying the land at a red book value, not necessarily a market value. Market values can cut both ways. They can go high and they can go low. So the risk is also theirs. They also have the risk that they will not necessarily get the planning that they need. I think personally, understanding a little bit that I do about foundations and 5 metres of pulverised fuel ash, it is far easier to build a small box with one concrete floor than it is to build lots of houses with separate foundations. And that's a technical point. I have no further comment. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. In 2019, Bath and North East Somerset declared a climate emergency, and a year later, in 2020, also an ecological emergency, recognising the severity of the degradation of the natural environment and loss of wildlife, the consequences of this, and the urgent need to take action to restore nature. Responding to the climate emergency is one of our council's core policies, alongside giving people a bigger say. The decision to sell the Entry Hill depot site without an ecological impact assessment and without proper consultation is failing local residents on those 2 core policies. Before taking a decision about the future of the currently unused site, we ask that the committee halts this process and asks for an environmental impact assessment and the production of a detailed report on the proposed use as a manufacturing site versus that of building council housing. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you both very much. We now move on to the part of the process which is the panel debate. And can I remind panel that we have a number of choices. We have a number of options for choices. First of all, the panel can move to dismiss the call-in, so the decision will take immediate effect. The second option is to refer the decision back to the decision-making body for reconsideration. And the third is to refer the matter to council itself to undertake the role of the panel. There's probably, I think, and it was pointed out just before the meeting, there is a fourth option, which is to defer a decision for more information. But I would also, I think, just draw attention to the role that the panel can actually make in the decision. And I'd hope that the decision makers will be looking at the grounds for the call-in and the discussion that's taking place at the panel when actually moving this decision forward, particularly when it comes to environmental impact issues and concerns that relate to this site, however that this site is going to be used. I'll actually hold back on my comments until other panel members have had a chance to state their views. And if there are any panel members who want to move one of those potential options, then happy to see that.
I think Councillor Roper has made a powerful case for the decision that Councillor Samuel made. We do need to support our local industries, and providing high-quality manufacturing sites is important. I've represented in the past, in another authority, a housing estate built on waste contaminated land, and putting it means you can't really dig your garden. You have to put a large cap of clay down, and even then you can't properly dig the garden because there's only a limited soil. It's really restrictive. It's got lots of risks. I certainly wouldn't want any to be looking at the risks of housing development on that sort of site unless there had been a very detailed engineering review. ADL did that and decided it wasn't going to work. It seems to me that we've got a very fair offer here, and I'd like to move that we dismiss the call-in and endorse the decision of the previous Cabinet member.
Thank you for moving that. Toby, do we have a seconder for that? Ian, do you want to say anything before?
Thank you, yes. I would second Toby's motion there, that we pass it back to the Cabinet member for the final decision. The site is, it is a windfall, it would appear, in my interpretation of reading the report and hearing Councillor Roper's view. The council had no intention originally to sell the land or market it, but have been approached. And I think actually this is going to feed into later in the year when the council does look at all its property assets and about how viable they are and whether, they could be sold off or marketed. As Councillor Roper said, if it is put on the open market, the value of the land can increase or it could decrease. And again, we have a renowned employer within the city who we would love to hang on to and love to encourage to develop and expand even further. As things stand in terms of land use, the land is designated for employment and it's underutilised, and it would offer a sustainable redevelopment, particularly because it's so close to the existing cross building on Midford Road. Whether there is a local plan review, or in the subsequent local plan review, whether the land is deemed to be suitable for residential, although it's never been deemed to be suitable for residential in the past for whatever reason, possibly the contamination, then there is going to be a safeguard that means that the increased land value, were the council to sell it on, we will benefit from that as an organisation. So I would like to second Councillor Toby's motion to go ahead.
Thank you. So that has been moved and seconded. I'm looking around to see if there's any councillors who want to join the debate on this. Looking at you, Colin.
Yeah, I just feel that the points that have been raised on the call-in, in terms of addressing them, it's really laudable to hear a Cabinet member supporting business, and I think that's something that we need to be stronger on, and that's great. But I think that whole thing, somebody knocks on the door and says, that would be useful for us, and let's just get round the table and negotiate, I'm not sure that is getting best value and it's following due process as per the Local Government Act. That said, I fully understood the points that have been raised today, and I just felt from my summing up, I don't support where we've gone on this proposal, and I feel as cross-manufacturing, they wouldn't want to feel or leave residents feeling that they'd picked our pockets. If it had gone to the market and they had purchased it at market value, then it's all good for everybody and they can move forward. But that's not what we're proposing today.
Any other contributions to the debate? If not, I'll just say a couple of words myself. Very clearly, this is not a clear-cut decision or a clear-cut judgment on this, but I'm not entirely sure there is such a thing anyway. So there is a kind of balance. And I'm certainly hearing the points that have been made about potential environmental impact issues and concerns the need for some kind of impact assessment and snapshot, although I'm also aware that that would be the case whether this is used for employment or it's used for housing. It's development of a site that has been empty for or not been used for a while. And I think the point has been made of this seems to be an opportunity gain because someone has come and knocking on our door. The question underneath that is, well, why is this an opportunity gain? Why wasn't this looked at and developed and marketed and what best use we could have got that in the past? That, in a sense, is water under the bridge, so not necessarily something that this panel can look at, although I do know a later discussion will be about the work programme for this panel, and one of the suggestions is about how property services make best use of the asset that we have of land and property within Baines, and whether this is an example of probably, if we'd picked this up earlier, there might have been a different result and we might have had a better outcome. And of course, outcome is about best value, and I don't think anyone else really doesn't see that merely in pound terms. But there are different outcomes for a site, whether that's housing, whether that's employment, the rest. Although I'm sure that, like other panel members, I'm glad to hear that if there is a change of use for the site and there's possible extra value to be taken out of the site, that any arrangements will make sure that there's a clawback for the council at a future point if it's residential or it is employment. I think the tipping point, if that's right for me, is that across the whole of Bath and North East Somerset, has always been discussion about how you use employment sites and how those seem to move towards housing and how you can retain employment, particularly how you can retain local employment. I think as a local authority, although most local authorities struggle with that particular side of the equation, and the fact that we are seeing an employment site retained for employment has a certain novelty value, and the fact that it is supporting a local business, that it will be expanding that local business, that there'll be more employment, actually negates against that business being likely to move or relocate in the near future. And again, living in the Somer Valley, we see too many sites in the Somer Valley that employment has disappeared and they are just left empty. I'm thinking of Welton Bibby. That all said, we now move, I think, to the vote on... Sorry? Sure.
Because I realised I missed out some point in the argument, because Councillor Hedges raised important environmental questions, and I was just going to say I regard those as a planning question rather than a question for our decision. Our decision is about the sale, and the environmental assessments that she calls for should be dealt with as part of the planning.
Thank you. So, moving to the votes, please can I see all those in favour of the proposal that the call-in is dismissed and the decision shall take immediate effect? Can I see all those in favour? Can I see all those against? So that proposal is moved. Can I say on that decision, and saying to the Cabinet Member, I'm sure that you will take account not only about the concerns that are raised about this specific site, and I take the point that some of these are planning concerns, but please can you also take note of some of the concerns about how we've got to where we are with this site, because it is less than ideal that it has ended up as a call-in decision. Certainly less than ideal that it ends up being a call-in at the first panel meeting after an election with a new administration. And please can we see better marketing and better use of assets that the council actually owns, so there can be a better discussion about best use. Okay, thank you very much. If we take a couple of minutes break, because I'm sure that there are plenty of people in the hall now who do not want to stay for the rest of the discussion, so I'll give you a chance to leave. Usual, I think, to have a call-in as our first piece of business in a new administration, especially as it was a hangover from the last administration. But I thought a useful discussion, and hopefully when we're talking about planning and other more corporate issues through the next year or a couple of years, the themes that came out in that call-in will be reflected through. So moving on next, we're coming on to the corporate strategy. So welcome, Dave. You've got a busy few days. Is it Cabinet next week and then Council the week after?
Yes.
So presumably we're the warm-up.
3 area forums so far, and more to come as well. So can't believe everyone left for the exciting bit. It's very, very disappointing with that. But really, I've turned on this one, but this one doesn't work. So I might need to cosy up to you, I'm afraid. Yes, good thought. So I'd like to introduce Corporate Strategy 2023 to 2027. And this is an update of the corporate strategy we adopted back in 2020. And essentially, as we're all aware, we had an election in May this year, a fresh manifesto, a fresh mandate, and a plan for governing over the next 4 years. The corporate strategy is the overarching document that sets out what the council overall hopes to achieve over that 4-year period of time, and how it makes those decisions, how it prioritises those decisions. So it's quite although it's not the most exciting sounding document, hence the sort of the exodus from the room, it's actually a really important document that sets out that blueprint over the next 4 years. So I'm really grateful to the work that's been done by officers, particularly in talking to those of us in the new administration who are wanting to make sure that our manifesto is imprinted onto that corporate strategy, to make sure that corporate plans and manifesto pledges are as one, working in tandem. So I'll end there and hand over to, I think, Andy, who's been working very hard along with Kerry on the strategy, to say a few additional words about it, and then we'll move to questions.
Yeah, just to add to that, it's really important from my perspective as Chief Executive to be able to have a framework within which the operational organisation works. So it is about translating a statement of, I suppose, political priorities into delivery that then can be evaluated, that people can check the performance as we go through the period, because from my perspective, the strength of me about corporate strategy is I can articulate the framework very clearly to our staff, and then we can deliver, and then as a council you can hold us to account for delivery against that strategy, and that's the key bit. So below this sit a whole raft of delivery plans, all of that sort of stuff that obviously will be reported on through the period of the corporate strategy. The most important thing, as Councillor Wood said, is to just see this as the framework within which the council will operate over the next 4 years, and I think that's the context I just wanted to give. Andy, if you want to say anything else?
Thank you. Thank you both. Any questions? I as I know that we're going to get the opportunity to debate this over a couple of meetings over the next few weeks. If not, Lucy. After you.
Yeah, sorry. I was wondering whether there's, looking at our 9 priorities, whether there's the cost of living crisis is going to dominate our administration will continue. So is there any way we can add a 10th priority or get some wording in that, you know, as residents looking down that list, having something leap out at you that says our council is kind of aware of this issue for us, this ongoing issue. I know the factors underpinning it are out with our control, but giving a clear message that we will support residents through this and, you know, in everything we do. I was struggling to think of the wording, but if there was if there was room for a 10th priority or another way of addressing it.
Can I come in on that point? I had very much the same thought that it's not as cost of living crisis. The poorer areas of our district, there is quite a lot of economic deprivation that I've seen in my time as a citizens' advice advisor and the like. So we need to think about the impact of our policies on people who are deprived economically and socially, and deal with deprivation in the context of the cost of living crisis. That the two of them need to be at the heart of our thinking in designing other policies. Thank you.
Absolutely, two really great points, and I suppose the key there is that the cost of living crisis is a huge thing right now, but for quite a section of our population, the cost of living crisis isn't new. It's a permanent feature of their lives, and inequality is so endemic in quite a lot for a lot of our population that it's been enshrined really as one of those key aspects in the 9. Tackling inequality is right there, and that will manifest as the cost of living crisis at the moment, and you'll see from the reports that comes out. Cost of living crisis absolutely comes out in the detail of it, but we recognise that that's not a temporary thing. It's generational for a lot of our residents, so it's baked right into the core of the process. And the current cost of living crisis being experienced by a wide range of people absolutely is coming out in the detail that follows out from this framework. So the framework tackles inequality, and the cost of living crisis action flows from that framework, but because inequality and tackling inequality is absolutely core to the centre of that framework.
I just wonder if I could just add to that, because as well as actually a core focus there on inequalities, which I can read out to you, but actually I think the key issue here, as Councillor Wood said, is that we're actually building on a lot of the things that are currently happening, and I think it's the point Will was making as well. So, for example, if you look at the section on focusing on prevention, and in particular, if you look at this, for example, it says at the top, here are some of the achievements we'll build on as we deliver our corporate strategy. Under focus on prevention, for example, it refers to the Community Wellbeing Hub. So the Community Wellbeing Hub has received over almost 2,000 referrals in the financial year 22-23 and spent a lot of its time and effort on addressing that cost of living crisis, as well as setting up 50 or so warm spaces during the winter. So I think the issue there is that as Councillor Wood said, look at that big inequalities outcome that we're seeking, we inevitably will be building on existing successes and work that we do and institutions that we set up, including the Wellbeing Hub. The Welfare Support Team, I'm just looking at what it said, provided 2.2 million in support for residents who needed help. We can circulate a little diagram we've done of all of the work that the CAB and all our partners have put into the community wellbeing outcomes. So just to sort of reassure that in terms of the work we've already done on tackling cost of living, that will absolutely be embedded in this strategy. But of the three, we have three principles. One of them is focus on prevention, which is crucial to that tackling inequalities, to create that community capacity so that we're more resilient to things like the cost of living crisis. And it says we'll invest in prevention across all services to tackle inequalities and improve local areas. And certainly the outcomes relating to health inequalities and to tackling the underlying issues around things like inequalities in education outcomes are the things that I think, as Councillor Wood said, are the long-standing issues that if we can get those right, we can build communities that are more resilient to the shocks and issues that I'm sure will come further down the road. And one thing I just finalise is the section there, which we haven't referred to on the economy, on developing good jobs, improving the median wage. Those are outcomes that our new economic strategy will be very much pulling out and having that strong, resilient economy and good jobs and good wages will definitely stand us in good stead to do the outcomes that Councillor Simon identified.
Thanks very much for that, Andy. And just to answer the specific question about sort of where it falls within the framework. So we've got in front of you page 7 and 8, I think it is, of the report pack. Sets out the framework, and that is the prism through which we take all of our decisions, identifies our priorities. So in that framework, we've got our existing core policies and our existing principles. New things here are three commitments that come through, and those are new, building on the previous core strategy. And one of those three commitments is around focusing on prevention. And the wording says, we'll invest in prevention across all services to tackle inequalities and improve local areas. That's one of the three kind of big new commitments that's come through as part of that process, recognising the centrality of tackling inequality, not only to our residents' lives, but also to our focus on prevention, absolutely flows from that, and the focus on improving our local areas too.
Thank you, Chair. So in terms of the corporate strategies, obviously when we say here we focus on a bigger say, but what mechanisms are in place so residents have a bigger say? So is there any specific mechanisms are in place? That's my first question. And the second one, what strategies are in place for effective delivery of services and initiatives for the residents? Thank you.
So a number of, giving people bigger say, a number of things that are already in place. We look at our area forums, for example. We look at the way we run consultations. We look at some of the mechanisms using, like citizens' juries and so on. All mechanisms to give people a bigger say, and in the rural areas, parish liaison meeting and so on. But actually, my feeling is that we can go further in how we give people a bigger say. So we can discuss with the public what the agenda is, what our programme is, what our manifesto is, seek their feedback on it. But I think there's an opportunity to engage with the public in new ways at the moment to help identify further priorities. And I particularly think that around community areas, geographic areas, but also around different types of community groupings that we have in Baines. And I think we've got an opportunity to go out to them in different ways to say what's important to Coombe Down, or what's important to Bath City Centre or to the Chew Valley, and work with them to identify what are the priorities that the council should be focusing on. So I think it's about listening and responding based on our current programme, but it's also about giving people the say over their area to help develop the priorities for that area. So I think that's the sort of thing that we've started to do over recent years, but we can really bring that to the fore and give more power essentially to residents. And you had a second question, which I've now entirely forgotten.
So what strategies are in place for effective delivery of services and initiatives?
Yeah. Yes. So we mentioned earlier about service and delivery plans that essentially say over a 3-year period that we have following on from this municipal year, a 3-year programme that puts in place all those things that we want to achieve flowing from our manifesto. The way that's monitored through a whole different range of methods, but having the right kind of KPIs monitored in the right way, I think keeps us quite outcome focused. Are the interventions that we're wanting to take having the impact and the effect that we want them to have? So that's something that we are looking at now and flows very much from the corporate strategy, a refreshed set of KPIs. It's a very boring answer, but it's the truth.
So I do think that we've made big strides in listening in the last 4 years, although many of the forum I go to are not particularly well attended. And I think that's a kind of issue, is how we can do something more populist, that we get more people along. We've done some work, we did one last night, is getting people in and getting them to vote on a range of things and telling them that we will then take those, and we actually had the officers there as well, and the officers even asked us to do some more votes. And it seems to me it's that second part of your sentence, which is address their concerns. Yeah. So, it's not just listening, it is carrying it forward, and I think if we do that, we will get a better press.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. No. Absolutely. I think that's crucial. I think been to a number of area forums now, as well as the one around where I represent in my ward, and they do great work and great representatives of the community and people that come along. But you're absolutely right. It's not necessarily the most populist lever at our disposal, the number of people that attend. And you can kind of see why any kind of meeting structure isn't necessarily going to be for everyone. It can be off-putting in its own ways, might not be relatable. So I like the approach that you've described, where you have something that's more interactive, more participatory, and more direct in how people do give their views. And that's kind of my preferred way of public engagement, is to just think a little bit differently in supplement, but think a little bit differently to how we've been thinking so far, getting great views from our current methods, but how can we go further, reach more people and test people's opinions, understand their priorities more, and then codify that into priorities for, say, a geographic area, and take that forward, I think, is the way forward.
Okay. Right. Would it be possible that you could outline a bit more about how we would meet the priorities in terms of good jobs and skills to thrive? I think that's an area where Bath has some challenge, and it's really good to see these on here, but I'd just like a bit more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that anything you wanted to expand on, either Will or Andy?
Yeah, I was just going to talk a little bit about our economic strategy that we're at the moment are developing a new approach really to our economy. And I think the first thing is to acknowledge, that we're doing the strengths and the weaknesses of our economy. And I think that's something that the strategy does, and highlight that. So obviously, there are a lot of strengths in our economy, but one of the things that we highlighted in drawing up this strategy is that, in particular, our median wage, is not good compared to other comparable authorities. And in particular, we have that issue of the type of economy that we are, that often does rely on that lower wages and retail and so on. So I think acknowledging that issue, and I know you just in the previous item had the discussion about what needs to be done, what levers can be pulled to retain jobs and economy within the area, and that's obviously all matter for conversation and discussion. But certainly in terms of the strategy, and the outcomes that are put in this framework, there's very much an emphasis on those outcomes of good jobs, high quality, high skilled jobs, good skills, and an economy that is, above all, one which helps us deliver our climate and ecological emergency outcomes, that sets all of those constraints that are built into the strategy. So there'll be more work that's going to come through on the economic strategy. I know that there have been previous presentations to the panel on the economic strategy, and I'm sure there will be more work done on that. So I think that's why it's there very much to sort of put that line in the sand that says, unless we can get that economy right and those elements of the economy right, then we won't be able to deliver in full the strategy as it stands. I don't know whether Will wants to say more about the economic strategy.
I think that's fine.
Sorry, I just had one other point. I just wanted to commend the officers on bringing together our manifesto, what we're hoping to achieve in manifesto commitments in this public-facing document, the layout and design of it. There was one, I was just thinking about how it looks for residents, and there's one kind of layer of information that I'm not quite sure why it's in there, or the importance of it. So in page 7 and 8, the bracketed statements under the core policy and under the principles. So the principle, the social and economic foundation point, and the points under the core policy that are bracketed, I'm not quite sure in terms of a public-facing document what they add, unless they're in a that they might be. I'd like to understand that. Is it a particular economic principle or reason for putting those in?
So the way the strategy is set out, the way the framework is set out, is we have an overriding purpose, then we have the core policies, then the principles and the values that underpin the delivery. So it is they're layers in that sense. So the policies and the principles help to deliver the purpose, and the values are what sit around the framework to make sure that from a staffing point of view, all our 3,500 staff understand the purpose, they're aligned to the purpose. Our service delivery delivers on both the policies and the principles, and then the values are what, as I say, help us to deliver that. I think when you're explaining it to partners and to people outside, it's much easier to explain than most strategies I've come across. Because actually I can say, we've got one purpose, we've got 2 core policies, 3 principles, 4 values. And then below that sits an enormous amount of information around delivery programmes. And that's the bit, I suppose, that as you go through the next 4 years, probably you're going to spend more time on, I suspect, as a panel, in terms of understanding more about the delivery mechanisms. This is just a framework that sits around that.
Yes, I suppose I was thinking, with the principles, that the point in brackets that it's a social and economic foundation repeated. Yeah, it's just understanding that those words.
I can just square that off. I'm building on what Will said there in terms of the framework. If you look on the page on section 5, it does set out why those words are used, and the reason they're used. Again, as Will said, there are several ways of looking at our strategy, several lenses, but they're all clear. And one really clear way that one can look at this strategy is through the use of what some councils have done, and which we're going to develop from this, which is, it's called a decision wheel, which is a way of looking at decisions we make to test whether or not they are meeting and how they're delivering our strategy. So that's a new thing for this council. So some councils have tested it, we've learned that. And what they all do, what those decision wheels do, is they break up the way of looking at this into these 3 elements. So there's this ceiling, the outer bit, which is the climate and ecological emergency. And there's that inner bit, the social and economic outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and which Councillor Wood went through in terms of the priorities on housing and so on. And then there's all of the work which other councils have mentioned that we're doing with the community, which is how we all work together and how we build a strong and resilient economy and a good, solid, resilient community. So when that, we haven't actually shared that at the moment here, we're just announcing the intention, and once this is subject to approval, obviously, through the process of Cabinet and Council, but once, and if and when this is adopted, that the Council will be moving towards this decision wheel approach, which uses this model. And one of the reasons that we put in there, I accept that for most people, but when we talk to our partners, having that shared language, seeing how other councils use it, and so that we can use those shared outcomes. We've found very recently, we've had some conversation with partners where they said, yes, that's something we understand, and we can join up our services better to deliver these big outcomes that we want to achieve.
Thank you. I just found myself putting my hand up and realised I didn't need to do that. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation and the comments. Colin and I were smiling at each other at some of the comments about our manifesto. I think we just need to remember that for a couple of us, while I agree, certainly the majority of this report support and understand. I think, as Will said, it's about delivery and priority and how that kind of pans out over the next few years. I've just put some words of caution in, though. I mean, clearly a corporate strategy is looking at the resources, looking at what you have, looking internally at what Baines as an area, as an authority, can actually do. But clearly there's the external forces as well. And what I always refer to as we should always have a department of unforeseen consequences about stuff that just happens. And that kind of, I guess, means a little bit more when we've just come out of COVID. We certainly didn't anticipate that 4 years ago when looking at a corporate strategy. But the reason I talk about external horizon scanning, if you like, is two bits. First of all, we can see some very clear problems coming along the horizon, and I've just jotted down about mortgage fixed-term deals coming ahead. The fact that cost of living crisis was something that we're all concerned about. But I think what's unusual at the moment, and I don't know if we would agree or not, but just coming back from Local Government Association conference in Bournemouth, meeting of councils up and down the country with government ministers being there. LGA conferences I've been to in the past, you'd expect to be seeing some direction indication coming from government ministers and spokesmen and women spokespeople from the governing party. And I have to say, my impression was tumbleweed blowing down the road. The fact that we seem to be having no direction coming at all from central government. And why did you expect that if a general election was 18 weeks away? We're still potentially 18 months away. So we seem to be, certainly the way I was looking at it, a total lack of direction coming centrally. And how do we, as just a council, one out of many others up and down the country, deal with that and deal with potentially being overwhelmed by external problems and external forces. And the easy bit would now, if I could say we need to do A, B and C, but I don't think any of us around here know how we're going to actually be able to deal with this, with the economic storms that are heading in our direction. Although you'd expect me to say, as a Labour councillor, that hopefully there may be some hope on the horizon for a government that takes a more positive interventionist role in the economy, and also, and I say this as someone who's been a councillor for a number of years and had lost my rose-tinted spectacles a long time ago, that more promises of working alongside local government and how, as a local government, we can work alongside a potential new government, although that is not baked in or guaranteed or whatever. Although I have to say I don't think I've ever seen a ruling party that appears to have given up quite so completely as the current one has done at the moment. So I'd say that. I suppose my question is we actually do know that we have got a very good officer team that, alongside, like other councils, dealt with the unforeseen consequences of COVID in a way. And are we bracing ourselves to deal with the next 18 months without positive interventions that you'd hope to see from central government?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and foreseeing the unforeseeable, or some of the unforeseeable that you can actually foresee in reality. Hard to predict, but I think it is worth just reflecting very briefly on what we have seen over the last 4 years and the ability of the council to thrive and contribute to the community in those circumstances. We've seen COVID and the council's response to COVID and the economic shock that followed from that. We've seen the pressure of inflation. We've seen the pressure of potential industrial action, and we've got a council and an officer team that really is adaptable and thrives and puts the community first under the face of those really what feel like unassailable pressures that we've had over the last 4 years. Obviously, the next 4 years don't necessarily look to be an easy ride for anyone, either in the country or in the council, and some of that is foreseeable, and I dare say there's a lot that will come forward in the next 4 years that we can't predict at the moment, but that we as a council need to have the ability to deal with. I don't know if you want to add anything, Will, to either the learning from the last 4 years or what you might predict for the next 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to make any comment on the politics of it, Councillor Moss, but yeah, look, from my perspective, it is about being able and prepared to cope with those shocks, and I think, as you rightly say, we've demonstrated as a council. I think, COVID was an incredible test for anybody, and I think, my view is this council dealt with COVID better than lots of other councils did for lots of reasons. And yeah, we will deal with whatever comes to us in the next 4 years. What I do know is we can't just sit here and wait for things to happen. I think from my perspective, what the corporate strategy does is it sets out a very clear framework of activity. Yes, things I'm sure will come along that will test us and may divert us at some stage through the 4 years, but the framework is very clear, the ambition is very clear, and the purpose is very clear, and that's certainly, as Chief said, what I'll be focused on delivering what's within the strategy, and that's for me why it's really important that we get this agreed early, so actually we can align the resources of the organisation to deliver for the communities out there.
A follow-up question mentioned inflation, and I think it was certainly in the last administration, and I guess it's because we got used to low inflation for so long that it was to a degree seen as historic, and I certainly think there was an underestimation by the administration, by all of us, about how inflation would actually hit over the last 4 years. We currently have high levels of inflation. We have a government that's talking about inflation coming down in the next 6 months, but no actual sign of that happening. I suppose it's a question for Andy. Is what kind of inflation modelling are we using when it comes to making predictions over the next few years, despite predictions coming from central government? And is there going to be any potential? So I'm looking at the time. How long have we got? And I guess there would be potential consequences for rising interest rates on deposits and assets.
Very good question, Councillor Moss. So, in terms of predicting the future and setting the council's budget, that's more of a scientific view can be taken, but you can't guarantee what inflation is going to do in the future. So what we need to understand when we put the budget together and set our proposals to council is understanding what we know now around our contracts, the way demand is currently being monitored, and also how demand is changing in the future, so we get the best and most accurate set of estimates for a robust budget. In terms of contractual inflation provisions, that's something that for probably the last 2 or 3 budgets we've been very accurate in modelling, because we base it on looking at CPI and RPI performance and then look at the trends going forwards. So we're taking an informed view. I'd say the one that definitely has cost money is pay inflation. But we've got to understand that, to have good people, you've got to pay inflation. We have to be able to meet people's requirements in terms of cost of living. And we are reviewing all of our current budget assumptions at the moment. I think the indication that we've had from our advisors, but also what we see in the news, is that inflation hasn't gone down at the level that was originally anticipated by the Bank of England, hence the increase in the interest rates. So we do need to adjust some of our levers in our future budgets. It's not a conclusive answer because there's lots of unknowns, but I think I've articulated that in terms of taking a scientific view to be able to model, we do our best at creating a very accurate model for that. Absolutely. For the last, I think really since COVID, that's something we've become really experienced at doing in terms of, worst case scenario, because of our, I think, and this is where I think we are probably a little bit more advanced as a council, because we've got the external income that does fund the council. COVID definitely identified that we're really exposed to volatility. So we always, when we do the budget modelling, look at a kind of red, amber, green set of scenarios. So red risk, really high inflation being continuing for the next 4 to 5 years. Green's the upside that it starts dropping within the next 1 to 2 to 3 years. And that's the type of approach that we take to our modelling.
Looking around, thank you very much for those presentations, and thank you for that discussion, which will continue. Moving on then to the final agenda item, which is the panel work plan. I know there have been various ideas circulated around about what the panel should be looking at and what should be discussing. Lucy?
Sorry, do we have a statement for the Cabinet member?
That's quite all right, Councillor Moss.
My apology, yes. Sorry.
Actually, I was going to open by saying it says Cabinet member update, which is a standing item for this meeting, but given the split of portfolios, you might want to consider as a panel which Cabinet member you want to get a regular update from, or whether you want both or 3 of us here, or I mean, I'm very happy to attend and report back as much or as little as you require. I won't keep you very long. Given I've only been in the role a couple of months, it's mainly been getting my feet under the table, really. Been meeting with key officers and understanding the financial position, understanding last year's outturn reports and where we are for this first quarter, but yeah, meeting key officers, building relationships, that kind of thing over the last couple of months. The Cabinet papers are now in the public domain for the Cabinet meeting this week. Obviously, I commend them to you for. There's a number of financial reports in there. You've got the Treasury Management outturn, you've got the Revenue and Capital outturn, and you've got the end of first quarter budget monitoring report. To focus on the revenue outturn for last year for a moment, pleased to report that we finished the year £60,000 in the black, which, given where we were at the halfway point of the year, which was we were predicting 4.5 million in the red, I think is a pretty remarkable outcome, actually. I think that's really, nothing to do with me. I wasn't involved, but I commend the work that my predecessor and the Cabinet jointly and officers particularly did at pulling that back in. There were a number of planned interventions during that
6-month period. We were hit with a larger than expected pay settlement, which obviously, we need to reward our staff appropriately. So there's no complaint about that, but it wasn't budgeted for, and so that had an effect. And the pressure from children's services was immense, and that's a problem that's true across the whole country. It's not a problem for us specifically. On the upside, I say we had some strong planned interventions. We had some really strong performance on income. The various income providing services did very well. The Christmas period was a huge success. The Christmas market went very well, was financially very successful. And the Roman Baths remained busy, not just during the Christmas period, but actually either side of that as well, which was a really encouraging thing. For the first quarter now, where we are now, first quarter of 23-24, the financial challenges are ongoing, and particularly still in children's services. It's not an easy picture when it comes to particularly children's services, but I mean across the board, we are already starting to see significant financial pressure, and so we will be again having to put management plans in place to make sure that we continue to meet service users' needs, but manage costs to bring things back in line. I say, given the way we achieved it last year, I have no doubt we will manage to achieve it again this year, but it is an extremely pressured financial environment. I think that's all I want to say, really. That's quite all right.
I thought I'd work off my iPad for this meeting. Next meeting I'm going to print out the agenda, have it in front of me, so it's a lot easier to actually see. So we've got a meeting coming in September, and we need to be looking at what we want the agenda for that. I think there's a couple of things ways to be able to do that. There has been the paper circulated, which is looking at, Kerry was looking at support for those most vulnerable. The Council Tax Reduction Scheme. Those are the words I was looking for rather than the summary about what it is. That's a piece of work that we can be looking at, and I think probably a small group of us rather than the whole panel over the next couple of months. And I know that there's a number of ideas of potential subjects to bring up for scrutiny. So, Lucy?
Yes, can I just say in respect of, Councillor Simon's paper that could officers working with a small group, working with officers and Councillor Elliott, could the officers come back to PDS with proposals for the reform of the council tax support scheme for that September meeting? Could we have that as a resolution, working with a small group of councillors? I think Councillor Simon and possibly one other to work with you on that.
Thanks, Councillor Hodge. Yes, happy to take that forward. I think what I'd request is, in terms of a working group, some councillors from the corporate PDS get nominated, so I can liaise with my welfare support and council tax manager.
I will will try to remember that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, very, very happy to support that, and I think that would be a good thing to, thanks to Councillor Simon for his work on the paper. Yeah, if we can bring it back to the September meeting, I'd very much like to see if we can get that to November Council so that we can then adopt it for next year's budget.
Okay.
If we, that is quite a tight timescale, so I mean, it will mean having to kind of come back to the PDS in September, and for you guys to make a decision to proceed. But we just about have space to do public consultation between then and the November corporate PDS meeting to bring it back to you again before it went to November Council. But it would be great if we could do that, because it would then get into next year's budget. I don't know if that's something you feel that you can support.
Yeah. I would certainly support doing it as quickly as we can. I think that there are agencies that will do the modelling to enable the zero. I mean, I think the starting point is we're trying to do it as a zero cost. We're not asking to put in a budget pressure on this. My view is that this is a rebalancing of an existing resource. And there are welfare agencies, I think, that can help us do those calculations, and Damien's in touch with them.
Yeah, sure.
So I hope we'll be able to make progress on the timescale you're looking at.
This is assuming, and hopefully rightly assuming, that we'll do some work between now and September, so that rather than taking it cold in September, we've actually got something to work on. So what I suggest is look at a small HAL first.
Well, just wanted to support the one that you did about I'll get there in a minute. Enforcement.
Okay. Yeah.
So I want there's 400 backlog, and we need to see that backlog cleared, and I'd like to bring that forward as a priority.
Yeah. Something for the work programme is looking at planning enforcement. I think it was a discussion that we were having, a number of us, just after the Entry Hill discussion. I'd absolutely agree when it comes to enforcement that you can probably take that a step further back and make sure that conditions and the way those conditions are put into planning consents are put in a way that they're enforceable. Ellen Jackson was pointing out, I know it's anecdotal, we've just had a hedge uprooted in Westfield, which is an old established hedge. Residents have complained, and we've realised that actually retention of that wasn't in the original planning consent that was put out. So I'd totally support the idea of enforcement, but probably part of that discussion is having something to enforce in the first place.
And clearing the backlog.
Yeah, yes, on that as well. I also know that there was another discussion, and again this comes out of our discussion earlier on, is to look at property services and how property services are working. I know there was a review that took place during and shortly after COVID, but I've been around for long enough at Baines to know that property services regard themselves as the geese that lay the golden eggs, and therefore should not be challenged. It's not necessarily a view that I hold, although I'm sure officers would say I'm being slightly unfair on them. But I'd hope reviewing how property services operate and how they deal with our assets, and our in the widest sense, is something we should be looking at. Okay, if that could go on to the work plan. Andy.
Just to seek a bit of clarity on that, Chair, so I'm sure colleagues in property services would be happy to give a briefing to the PDS panel as whether you want to consider that as a future agenda item or a supplementary briefing that they provide in advance of any forthcoming decisions.
Okay. My view would be a supplementary briefing. We've got 2 to 2.5 hours for these meetings, and they can be taken up quite quickly. I think the joys of supplementary briefings is that that other councillors can equally be involved, because it's more of a training and educational issue. I know that one suggestion that something the panel could look at is the cost of traffic schemes. And I'd suggest that similarly is a briefing training exercise as much as it is an examination by this panel. Because I think there's a lot of things that the council does that probably costs more. When you look at the initial prices, think how much, until you actually realise how much. Another example, I think, is probably playgrounds and play equipment. You look at those being put up in your patch and think how much. So the idea of a briefing from property services sooner rather than later would be great. Okay. Lucy?
I just think in suggesting the property services, there was a number of outcomes from the Montague Evans report when we last had a report to PDS, and it was really to make sure that we get an update on what happened as a consequence of those. So rather than just a kind of briefing, I wouldn't mind focusing on those outcomes that were proposed proposed last time. The other thing I was just going to say about the highways, the suggestion with that, again, it was an item that was proposed for the work plan, and the aim of the item was to have some benchmarking about the cost of our highways infrastructures compared to other local authorities. That was the aim of the item, which the briefing was actually just a breakdown of the cost of a very expensive crossing. So the question wasn't really addressed, and I thought we could go back and ask for that again. Yeah.
Toby?
I mean, Lucy raised the question of follow-up of things. It's useful at the end of our minutes to have a list of actions identified and then a progress list for those actions, so we can make sure they don't get, it's a regular agenda item. It's a good discipline that I've found in the past.
That will appear within the actual work programme grid itself. Okay, I'm looking around. I'm also looking at the time, and it is 6:02, and I have to say by preference 2-hour meetings to 2.5 hours the optimum, so we're headed into the orange time, or the amber time. I know the previous panel chairs have kept it going for quite a few hours longer, but I do not intend to do that. The ability to concentrate and the willingness to live kind of goes after about 2.5 hours. If there are no other further suggestions to the work programme at this point in time, please, as panel members, take the opportunity, if you've got ideas, to circulate them to all of us, but particularly Lucy and myself, who will be looking at agenda planning for the future. And if there is anything else, and anyone else wants to say, thank you all very much for a productive meeting, and we managed to get a call in as the first item of business of the new administration, which is impressive. And thanks very much, and have a good evening.